Is there anything you would have done differently?
We reported a true story.
Our colleague Brian Williams is back in Kuwait City tonight after a close call in the skies over Iraq.
Controversial Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh and questions about Kavanaugh's drinking in the past.
Sean Hannity, come on up, Sean Hannity.
Today, Andrew Cuomo is having a moment.
Well, hello. I am Chris Steyerwalt.
And I am not Eliana Johnson.
Welcome to Ink Stained Wretches, where we break down what's going wrong and what's going right with the American news media. And the non-Eliana Johnson voice that you just heard is my friend, the great Josh Kraushaar, who is the editor of Jewish Insider. Is that correct?
That is correct. Also a longtime listener, first-time caller, first-time host, co-host on Ink Stained Wretches, and also a Fox News political analyst on the radio and on Special Report. So have a little bit of the media experience as well.
And a person who I have followed closely, because what Josh is really good at, and that's in really short supply, is providing dispassionate political analysis. And it's hard to tell with Josh. I've known Josh now for 10 years, something.
Probably more than that now.
And I have no idea how Josh votes or if he votes. And I know that he likes baseball. I know that he loves his family. I know that he cares about political journalism and journalism generally, but is cool about it. And I have always admired that. So I'm very glad that you are here.
Well, thank you, Chris, for those kind words. I mean, you're sort of a mentor of mine, getting my foot in the door and doing some of the TV side of political journalism. But yeah, I mean, look, I got into this business when, the goal was to call the balls and strikes, to use a baseball term, and to actually, I mean, I love politics. I love covering campaigns and elections, but part of the fun in that is actually, not the people who kind of get invested in just taking sides and just saying the same thing over and over again doesn't interest me. And we're trying to, and my goal is always trying to get to the bottom get to the facts, get to the truth, and really just cover these really crazy stories that we see on a daily basis with as much dispassion as possible.
Give us the 90-second vocational story of you. Where'd you start? Where'd you go? And how'd you get here?
Yeah, quickly. So my first job was as a researcher at the Almanac of American Politics. I was a political junkie, then moved on to the hotline. I worked with Chuck Todd and doing the coverage of elections, House races in particular. Went to Politico when it started. Was there for about 3 or 4 years. Spent a lot of time at National Journal, which was a sister publication of The Atlantic, covered politics, elections, wrote a column there. And then most recently was at Axios, where I put out a political Sunday newsletter, and now I am editor-in-chief of Jewish Insider, where we cover everything from anti-Semitism, the Middle East, but yes, the political debates over those issues, and that's what I've brought to the table in that role as well.
Well, all right. If a young person wants to have a respectable and successful journalistic career, there is someone to emulate. Okay, so we always begin with the front page. And what else could be on the front page this week except for tariffs? The news about the news story about tariffs was the amazing arc on, I guess it was Tuesday, in which an account called with Bloomberg in its name said that the tariffs were going to be suspended, and it drove markets on a $1 trillion swing. And then the White House said, fake news, not true. How did you observe this?
So this is a sign that even the smartest people, the business titans, investors, have trouble in this wild west of media on figuring out what's true or not. There was a Twitter account by Walter Bloom. This is not actual Bloomberg. It's Walter Bloomberg has a Twitter account, which is pretty popular, and it tends to cite the Bloomberg newsfeed, which is a very reliable source of business news. But a lot of people erroneously picked up this erroneous tweet by this Walter Bloomberg account, where he essentially misinterpreted an interview that Kevin Hassett, the Trump economic advisor, said on Fox earlier in the morning, that there would be a pause on the tariffs at that point in time. And my goodness, literally billions of dollars changed.
Trillions, yeah.
Because people didn't actually take the minute of time to actually check the facts, and instead relied on this one random Twitter account. It is funny that like a Walter Bloomberg may be more influential than regular Bloomberg, at least in that moment. But that's kind of where we are now in how we get news. That Twitter, X, you can make stuff up and have a blue check, and people won't actually take the time to figure out what's true and what's not true. And that's part of the problem, just writ large. But you would think that people who are investors who care about the markets would spend a little more diligence than what actually happened that day.
They talked to the proprietor of the Walter Bloomberg account, who is not Walter Bloomberg. The Wall Street Journal did. And the proprietor said, I couldn't find anything on the main wires at the time. After a quick search on X, I traced the headline to a post by T3 Trading Group, LLC. Given the market movement, up 4.5%, I deemed the headline reliable and posted it at 10:13. So what you had was, you have this account, and this is a person or people who a Bloomberg terminal is very expensive. I don't know what it costs now, but once upon a time it was $200,000 or something to have a Bloomberg terminal. And this person has one and shares and has developed this massive following because it's sharing updates from the Bloomberg Business Wire with the X audience. This person saw the interview, saw discussion of the interview, saw what this other user posted, concluded this was going down, posted it, and then was affirmed in the choice by markets that were also reacting to what he was doing. So it was a real self-licking ice cream cone.
It's like a game of telephone where, right. And it's not just, look, it's not just random people or even investors that misinterpreted the tweet and didn't do their fact checking. CNBC picked up the tweet and they, put a big chyron on the screen, and they said, usually it wasn't that long ago where to get news to make it to the cable news network, it would have to be fact checked. But the CNBC anchor actually said, we're going to try to source this and figure out what's going on in real time. But they, in the meantime, affected a whole lot of the markets themselves by actually blasting this tweet without doing their own fact checking. So, it was a game of telephone. It does seem to be sort of a metaphor of how the media works these days. Not a lot of fact checking, a lot of vibes and vibe shifting, not a lot of actual reporting. But no, I think part of the story is it wasn't just this Walter Bloomberg account, but it was CNBC, it was Reuters sending news over its wires. There wasn't the kind of due diligence and institutional checking that you would expect from even the big dogs.
Here's the real kicker. It turned out that the tweet was quite accurate, because what the tweet said was that Trump was considering a 90-day pause. The White House said that was fake news. The White House press secretary went out and said, President is not considering any such thing. That's Tuesday. Wednesday, lo and behold, what do we have? We have a 90-day pause. We have exactly what this post said. Now, the post was, what did the New York Times say? Fake but accurate. It was not true in the sense that it had not been properly sourced and vetted, but it was quite accurate in that obviously they were considering a 90-day pause, and they did deliver that 90-day pause. So market-based journalism is about providing people the 30 seconds of lead time that they want so that they can try to take advantage of news, right? The Fed minutes, who can get the Fed minutes out first, who can do all that stuff first. And it puts a high premium on immediacy, low premium on accuracy. And that was quite a little journey they went on.
Well, my 401k is happy, at least for the moment, but this is how Trump's White House does operate on vibes, and he changes his mind, as we know, on a whim, and maybe by reading something that he sees on television. So, it is interesting how this news kind of originated, because on Fox and Friends, the question was reflecting the zeitgeist that Trump might consider this 90-day pause, and they asked whether he would consider it to Kevin Hassett, and he said, yeah. And then he paused and said, but the president's going to do what the president's going to do. And that was how it originally got misinterpreted. But there was something in the ether that this was being discussed, and it just got everyone jumped the gun a little too soon.
So through this process, there were 2 points of view put forward by the administration. One was, we'll call it team abundance. Elon Musk, Scott Bessent, Hassett, who said, tariffs are a negotiating tool and we're going to go to zero tariffs. This is what we're going to do. We're going to use this hammer to get other countries to drop their barriers to trade, and we're moving toward a utopia of free trade. And then on the other side, you have Peter Navarro, I assume JD Vance, I don't know where he's been on this, and some others who say, and certainly the Commerce Secretary Lutnick, who say, no, the point of the tariffs is to remake the American economy. This is not about having a fairer form of globalism, but indeed this is purposeful protectionism. And what the press secretary said to questions about this was, do you remember? She said, boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. Boys will be boys. They're going to fight. They're going to say stuff, and we're going to let them say stuff, and we're not worried about it because they're going to go through it. One spokesperson for Team Tariffs as protectionism is Batya Ungar-Sargon from the Free Press, who in an appearance on Fox News said that the crisis in masculinity in America today stemmed from the decision to outsource manual labor to jobs overseas, a move that has deprived millions of American men of a purpose. Donald Trump, she said, is actually saying no more to this and the crisis in masculinity, which is, of course, why young men feel so attracted to what he's offering. And when I heard that, I thought, I don't know that you know what tariffs can do. I don't know if you, I think certainly it's true in the sense that there is a belief among many men, mostly, I assume, in America today, that says it was more valorous, it was better when more people worked in coal mines and steel mills and textile factories and made consumer goods and low finish products. I'm sure that there are many who feel that way, but I was taken by the sort of spiritual attitude. I wrote a piece about sort of this. I think it was before I read what she said, in which there is I think I'll call it an equity attitude among the protectionist folks who are not interested in that. If Team Musk is Team Abundance, to use the dialectic, to use the discussion that's taking place on the Democratic side right now, which is sort of the progressives versus the abundance Democrats. This is also abundance versus equity. And the Team Equity is saying that this isn't really a financial consideration. This isn't an economic consideration. This is a spiritual, emotional, moral consideration.
Yeah, so I think Batya Ungar-Sargon has called herself something along the lines of being a MAGA Marxist, or at least there is this moment that we're experiencing right now where everything the Republican Party, the conservative movement believed in when it comes to a lot of things, but certainly the economy, is being thrown out the window because Trump is in a totally different universe. You know, Trump fundamentally is more in the Peter Navarro camp. He has been talking about tariffs, loving tariffs, attacking Japan, now attacking China for eating America's lunch for decades. So his fundamental worldview is Peter Navarro's, and Peter Navarro's is the most outspoken protectionist in the White House. He was a Democrat. He spoke at the Democratic convention for Hillary Clinton or for the Clintons in '96. So this is someone who is not coming from a conventional conservative view. You know, there are a lot, I think, more advisors in the White House that come from the conventional perspective that, yes, they're supporting what Trump says because they're working for Trump, but they fundamentally want to get to a point where they can negotiate these tariffs down. But the problem is that there is this like incentive structure in on social media, which Batya, I think, represents. She's a columnist for the Free Press, but she certainly has gotten a lot of attention for her commentary on social media. And in the real world, there is not much of a constituency for Marxist MAGA Marxism or socialist MAGAism, even though Trump is trying to kind of move the party in a different direction. But online, all you need to have is like 1,000 true believers, and you can go viral and get a lot of attention. And that's what, her commentary on Fox and elsewhere has been. And then this notion that like there's a crisis in masculinity because we don't have enough manufacturing jobs, low paying jobs to I think in the words of the Commerce Secretary, like to screw.
An army of millions of people screwing little screws into iPhones.
I mean, that is, I don't think that's what most Americans want. If you look at the polling, if you look at general sentiment in this country, but all you need to do is have a small number of people who claim that they represent this new worldview, and boom, like it's online, you see it on X, and all of a sudden stuff like that goes viral. I think what's going to get Trump in trouble politically is that a lot of his advisors, a lot of people who he listens to are way too online. This is what got the left in trouble, the Democrats in trouble quite a bit during the Biden administration. And I think it's even worse right now in the Trump administration. But they see these influencers online and they go viral, they get attention, and they really don't speak to that much of a constituency in the country. Even people who are, working class, people who have blue collar jobs or working class, they want to make more money. They don't want the price of goods to go up. They're going to be the first to get antsy if it costs more to buy an iPhone or it costs more to buy a cup of coffee. So there is this unreality that I think the Batyan Gersargan view represents that claims to speak for a lot more people than it actually does.
This is your predecessor as guest host, Megan McArdle, has likened it to the effect of Texas high school football game. If 12,000 people interact with your tweet, it feels like something big is going on, but it's fewer people than go to a Friday night football game in Texas. And that weird thing. So basically, and I think that's exactly the right parallel with the Biden administration. It's winning arguments that, practically speaking, no one is having, right? It's arguments that have no following, don't have a connection to the lives of normal people, and you want to win that argument, but at a substantial cost. Now, speaking of the fight on the left, poor old Gretchen Whitmer, man, I will tell you what, the derby to become the palatable moderate among Democrats, and we've talked on this podcast about California Governor Gavin Newsom's podcast and that bit. Well, Gretchen Whitmer made her big play on this, which was she went and kicked it with Donald Trump. We're recording this Thursday morning, Thursday afternoon, and she on Wednesday, in the most impropitious timing imaginable, was in the Oval Office to be singled out for praise by Donald Trump, to be present when he was firing off some very wild executive actions targeting his political enemies, and while he was talking about tariffs. And I wonder what you think, because here's what I watched. I'm watching Newsom, ham-fistedly, but in a sort of controlled demolition kind of way out in California do it. I watched John Fetterman go down to Mar-a-Lago and meet with Trump, but behind closed doors. I've watched other Democrats try to find a way early on to agree with Trump. And then I saw Whitmer try to do it and blow it, because obviously the sell-by date on cooperative bipartisanship has probably passed for most Democratic primary voters.
Yeah, I mean, boy, there's so many thoughts I have on this. Number one is there's so many politicians that try to kind of look at what happened in the past instead of anticipate what's going to happen in the future. Trump is in the middle of watching his approval ratings decline. He's creating havoc in the markets. This is not a moment where Democrats should want to be seen working with Trump or being close to Trump. And that's been there's a middle ground between being 100% resistance all the time, which was not helpful throughout his first term, but there's also a political self-awareness you need to be like, okay, this is a guy who's self-destruct in real time. Maybe I want to keep a little distance at this moment. This is not the moment to be talking about getting federal investment at an Air Force base in Michigan. And I think that speaks to, I've always thought Whitmer was a little bit overrated.
Totally.
National politician. There are a lot of good politicians in a certain state that have a certain affect that, speak to the state's zeitgeist, but just don't translate nationally. Andy Beshear is another one, a governor from Kentucky who's super popular, Democrat, red state, deals with natural disasters, has done a really good job of kind of speaking to the public in the wake of natural disasters, getting money from the federal government. But if you see him speak, if you see him on the convention stage, it's not someone who's president. I don't think is presidential.
And wouldn't do any better with Democratic primary voters nationally than Charlie Baker or another moderate, successful Republican governor of a blue state.
Totally. And Whitmer is like one of those people who she ran against.
Looks good on paper. She looks good on paper.
Blue state, purple state battleground governor, but she ran against two pretty weak Republicans, and she's gotten lucky along the way. Look, I just think this was a moment where she wasn't showing her best political instincts. A lot of Democrats I talked to were kind of stunned at how tone deaf she was and being in the White House at that moment. And, I also think that there's this divide in the Democratic Party over whether they should sort of say some protectionism, some tariffs are good. She's in that camp. There are other Democrats, like a congressman from Pennsylvania, Chris DeLuzio, who made similar comments. Jared Golden, who's a swing district Democrat in Maine. But a lot of the more ambitious Democrats outside of Whitmer have realized that if they think the economy is going to hit some rough patches, it would be better to be just full steam ahead against Trump's economic policy. Josh Shapiro has really taken the reins on that worldview. And I think that's the smarter political play. So for Whitmer shouldn't have been near Trump during this moment of self-immolation, but it was also not really smart for her to kind of praise parts of the tariff and protectionist regime at a time when the smart money in the party is going the other direction.
It's very hard to say to progressive Democrats, we're free traders now. Now we're free traders. Bernie Sanders, others, people who are afraid of their connections with labor unions. The UAW came to Trump's announcement ceremony. They're in. And it's very hard for Democrats to envision a world where they are the party of everybody wants to be the party of the working class because nobody wants to say that they're the party of the elite. And for Democrats, tariffs really speak to the problem, which is the rising if you'll excuse me, the emerging Democratic majority is rooted in college-educated, knowledge workers, suburban, upwardly mobile, affluent folks. It's multi-ethnic, multicultural. It's urban, suburban, and that's their growth sector. But who wants to say, yes, we are turning our backs on the working men and women of the United Auto Workers in the manufacturing sector? And I think it's such a tricky pivot. I assume that Democrats will opt to try to just fudge it.
Yeah, it's always smart politics to be like the opposite of who's in power, and that's the general smart political play. And if Donald Trump is doing his best Walter Mondale pro-union, pro UAW impersonation, Democrats should be the party of sunny optimism and not. I mean, I think that's sometimes the party views change, and sometimes you have to adapt. And today or this week was an example of Whitmer not getting that memo.
If you can go from Mitt Romney in 2012 castigating Democrats for being soft on Russia to 2016 with Democrats excoriating Donald Trump for being the handmaiden of the Kremlin, we know that oppositional definition is a real thing in politics. Okay, federal judge. This is the ongoing saga of the White House press corps. Federal judge says White House's punishment of Associated Press is unconstitutional. This is from CNN. Government offers no other plausible explanation for its treatment of the AP. The Constitution forbids viewpoint discrimination, even in a non-public way, in a non-public forum like the Oval Office. McFadden of the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C., wrote in the 41-page ruling. President Donald Trump. Oh no, that's just the cut line. Okay, so we knew that there would eventually have to be a ruling on this, on the viewpoint discrimination against the AP for what is a government function, right? The president, the White House is a government agency, a government office, and if they explicitly discriminate against outlets on the basis of what they say and how they report, then what do you think the Supreme Court though says about this, Josh?
Well, look, this is just step one. It's a victory for the AP in the interim, but the judge also said that the White House has a week to appeal. I'm no lawyer, but I do think that and by the way, this was a Trump appointed judge, so it does suggest that there is, broad support perhaps for that legal decision. But look, I think it's a tough one, and the White House is saying they have the right to choose who's in the pool and who can be in the pool. I'm more interested in the politics of this on multiple fronts. Number one, the issue when you look at polls of how many people support Trump's decision to change the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, which is what this is all about, because the AP doesn't want to use Gulf of America in their coverage, and they have the right to do that. That is like the least popular thing that Trump has done, according to a whole lot of polls that have tested the big decisions Trump has. Maybe the tariffs poll a little lower right now, but almost everything else, that's one of the least popular decisions. So for Trump to kind of hold his political capital on that issue against the AP may not be a great long-term play. And for the media and the White House Correspondents Association, I'm a little surprised how many other media outlets really haven't as aggressively had the AP's back. I mean, they've certainly supported them rhetorically. They've signed on to their legal. Some media organizations have joined their legal case. But after this happened, a lot of the traditional broadcast and print outlets could have just boycotted the briefing and said, if you want Cat Turd to ask the questions at the White House briefing room and you think that's going to get you good coverage, then go for it. And use some leverage of your own. And I think part of the problem in the White House Correspondents Association and the media writ large is that even though they claim to be for the media principles and for the AP to get back in the pool, they've not been willing to kind of show their leverage, use their leverage, spend a little bit of political capital to actually back it up and force the White House to change its mind. So, I think this may come to a nice conclusion if the Supreme Court agrees with the lower court ruling, but we're a long way from that.
The man said that an ethic without sacrifice is no ethic. And this is definitely the case where the way that the White House Correspondents Association formed and took power during Woodrow Wilson's administration was just by refusing. They just collectively, they colluded and said, we're not doing it. If you won't let us pick the people who are credentialed to come in, then we will not come in. And that's what they have. But as you say, it's such a competitive media environment. And the idea that the New York Times would say, no, we're not coming on Air Force One. No, we're not going to be there is for now unthinkable. But that's really the only tool that they have. It isn't to have a sit-in at the White House Correspondents Association awards dinner or cancel a comedian. Their only power is the power to refuse. There's also a piece from Oliver Darcy's Status, which I don't know what all is in it because I will not pay the shocking, I forget how shocking the amount of money is that they want for the Status newsletter, but it's a jaw-dropping sum that they want for their newsletter. But the word in the free part was that the White House refused to distribute a pool report filed by a reporter from the Dallas Morning News that mentioned the fact that the Associated Press was turned away. And this gets to the next question, which is, it's not really the pool. It isn't the pool. It's the White House. It's just the White House picking. There isn't an association press pool anymore. That doesn't exist. And if the White House gets to pick and choose which dispatches it will distribute and which it will not distribute, then there's nothing reliable and nothing useful.
Yeah, I mean, this is what happens when you kind of try to give an inch and try to compromise and you don't use your leverage. The White House, they are taking every advantage, and it's very odd. They're just not. I think they didn't release one of the press pool reports that mentioned the Associated Press. I think that was the thing that set them off. But the White House, there are two separate distribution feeds. There are people who are members of the White House Correspondents Association who get their own feed through the association. But then the White House, for people who are not members of the association, and for a lot of journalists, they get it through the White House. It is a little bit of an unusual arrangement. In theory, you should be able to sign up, and maybe get an email like you're on a listserv, and shouldn't be reliant on the White House to get updates, on the president's movements. But that's the way it is. There hasn't been a whole fight over changing it. And if the Correspondents Association keeps on making concessions and not fighting back, the White House is going to continue to go after them and win these fights.
So we now go from market illiteracy to legal and judicial illiteracy in coverage. Supreme Court gives boost to Trump administration's deportation plans under Alien Enemies Act. This is NBC News. The ruling in which the justices were divided 5-4 in part means the Trump administration can resume deportations under the rarely used wartime law so long as the detainees are given due process. Now, look, I understand it is hard for non-journalists to sort through, or for non-lawyers to sort through a Supreme Court ruling and make a determination. But the coverage on this was wild. It comes out, and because Chief Justice Roberts is writing to strike down essentially part of a decision from a district judge who had ruled against the Trump administration on these deportations to El Salvador. You see that, and I could have picked any number of headlines, but because there were many like NBC's headline, that it's a boost, that it's a help. What all 9 justices said was there has to be due process. The more fundamental argument here isn't, can the administration deport people? We know the administration can deport people, for sure. The question is, do the people who are not citizens have a right to due process and access to Article 3 courts so that their case can be heard before they're deported? This was a substantial setback to the argument that had been made by many in and around the administration, which is the courts are violating the Constitution by telling the president how and when and the circumstances under which he can direct the deportation of people. The Supreme Court affirmed due process. This is a setback for that argument, but the coverage would have led one to believe that this was a massive victory for Trump.
Yeah, I wanted to give a shout out to one of my favorite columnists, Jason Willock at the Washington Post, who got it exactly what you said, Chris, that he wrote a column saying that this was actually a setback for the White House, a victory for due process. In a column he wrote this week, his headline was "Ignore the Trump administration's gleeful rhetoric on the Alien Enemies Act ruling. This was a setback." And he also kind of warns at the end of his column that there could be a confrontation with the Supreme Court if the Trump administration doesn't abide by that part of the ruling and if they're going to use the Alien Enemies Act, which they did give the permission for the administration to do, but it has to go, every case has to go through the court system, the legal system. Every person involved has to be able to have their due process rights. And that may be the big test. We'll see if the Trump administration goes through with that, follows through with that. If they don't, that is, you hear the word constitutional crisis mentioned a lot. I think a lot of it is sloppy and not relevant. But when someone like Jason Willock basically raises that prospect, that makes you really understand that there could be a big conflict coming up.
This is the Yuval Levin test. This is the Yuval Levin standard. What is bad or dangerous is different from what is a crisis, and what is a crisis means if the administration refuses to comply with the Supreme Court's directives. Okay, now we move to one of your specialities, and this is decoding the politics of Israel for an American audience. You flagged this piece from your own publication. Netanyahu pushes back on anti-Israel trends in meetings with podcasters. What's up with that?
Well, as a student of politics, and this was a brief visit that the Israeli prime minister made to the United States earlier in the week, and it was interesting, I thought, that he did not, on this visit, meet with lawmakers, but instead spent time with not just podcasters, but influencers, columnists, radio show hosts, a wide mix across the ideological spectrum. Sean Spicer was in the room, Dave Rubin, Tim Pool, and a host of others. But it reflects the sort of this law, and this is not just about Israel, but I think you see this in our politics between the sort of the traditional mainstream, the traditional establishment versus the emerging kind of grassroots online constituencies. And on Israel, Israel in the Republican Party gets overwhelming support, but there are these divides when you listen to enough podcasts on the right, when you sometimes read or listen to sort of commentary from a younger group of conservatives. So Netanyahu apparently is knows that there are changes in the media trends and media consumption of Americans, especially conservative Americans. So to me, this reads as sort of a seminal moment where it's not, you can't just rely on talking to lawmakers or talking to the big name anchors or columnists or Jewish Insider. You want to talk to the influencers that may not be big names in the general world, but have outsized influence these days with certain groups of people, and especially in the right-wing movement.
And we talked previously on this podcast about one of the perils, though, of this, which is there's less predictability. You cultivate the online podcast audience, and then one day you wake up and Joe Rogan is yelling about you deporting hairdressers, and people are saying that it lacks the to bring a Christian perspective to this. It's like the difference between a megachurch and a denomination. You're going to get more flexibility in your megachurch and your independent megachurch, but you're going to get a lot less predictability in what you get. And that's part of this whole Wild West thing, which is you can try it out. You can find new places to go. You can push into different spaces, but it gets weird out there quick.
Yeah, and one issue we've covered a lot about in the same space is that there's been a growing amount of anti-Semitism. You listen to Tucker Carlson's podcast, you listen to Joe Rogan, who had a Holocaust denier on his show and didn't ask any tough questions to someone who's out there and really out in the far extremes of discourse. That is the kind of stuff that there's no gatekeepers anymore. The stuff that we assume what would make it kind of into our media diets, people are consuming this stuff and they're not getting the type of fact checking or historical context that we would expect in the old world.
Is there tension between sort of this very online new right that is sometimes anti-Semitic and often anti-Israel with the MAGA agenda? Because on the one hand, we see them nuking these colleges and universities and their funding on the grounds of that they suborned anti-Semitism in protests that were on their campus, using that as the rationale for cutting off research funding. But we also do, to your point, see this growing trend about Holocaust denialism, anti-Israel sentiment, and whatnot on the right. How real is that, and how much of that is that tension something that will cause heartache?
So it goes back to the original point, which is that a lot of these online trends don't necessarily reflect the actual reality of the Republican Party's views on these issues. In fact, the reason I think why the Trump administration has been a very stalwart supporter of Israel, and that most Republican lawmakers on Capitol Hill overwhelmingly support Israel, is that that's where the public opinion is right now. The red flag, though, is if you go into the crosstabs and if you look at some of the kind of underlying trends, it's that younger 18 to 29 demographic that is the podcast audience. That is the people who are not getting news from Fox or from traditional sources, and that is where you're starting to see a little bit of movement in a different direction. And that is, I'm sure that's a big reason why Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu decided to have this meeting and tried to kind of directly respond to some of those questions and commentary going on those podcasts.
All right, that brings us to business news. The news about the news business, and you flagged that CNN is getting back in the town hall business. Anderson Cooper, we're on Wednesday. There was a little moment, maybe Colin will play it for us. There was a little moment where Anderson Cooper was taking a question from the audience for Bernie Sanders and got pronoun corrected. So maybe we play that here.
We're back with Senator Bernie Sanders. I want to introduce Grace Thomas. She's a local civil rights attorney. She's a Democrat. Grace?
They, them pronouns, actually. Thank you.
Oh.
Good evening, Senator Sanders. Polling and turnout data indicate that men of all racial demographics are turning away from the Democratic Party.
So we're back. CNN had a lot of success, it seemed like, for a long time doing these town halls. Fox imitated a lot of that, had their own successes on town halls. The first one, 4 members from battleground districts: Mike Lawler, Republican of New York; Ryan McKenzie, Republican of Pennsylvania; and Jahana Hayes and Derek Tran, Democrats, one from Connecticut, one from California, that they're going to do a town hall moderated by Jake Tapper and Caitlin Collins. These things are more expensive, I can tell you, than a regular hour of broadcasting in which you're just paying labor and it's all amortizable costs for the infrastructure. These are a little more expensive. You got to have an audience. It's a lot more work. The ratings you do get a little rating spike. You get a little something. People like a live audience. They like that energy. What did you see?
Well, look, I enjoy some of the town halls. I'm not sure if Derek Tran and Johanna Hayes are going to be must-see TV. I mean, these are pretty obscure lawmakers, not really that prominent and not really that reflective of any larger issues at play. So I'm not sure ratings-wise it's going to be all that successful. But look, there's a question of how many ways you can slice like an average, 24 hours when you're trying to cover the news different ways. Like there's only so much of like repeating the same headlines over and over again that you can do. I guess CNN has a show where you have that, Thunderdome with 5 different people yelling at each other, and that's one way of doing it. You now have the town hall format, which you can do every once in a while and get Bernie Sanders on and get now some lawmakers on. It's just hard to kind of figure out ways to recreate presenting the news, and that's a challenge that a lot of cable news networks are dealing with. I like it during presidential campaign season. I like watching the big time candidates debate each other or have the opportunity to get challenged from voters. But this is an off year. There's not a whole lot going on, and I'm not sure if this is really going to move the needle.
Okay. This is from Steve Battaglio at the Los Angeles Times, the great Steve Battaglio. Broadcast television is in trouble. Stations are asking Washington for help. And this outlines the effort from the National Association of Broadcasters. And to disclose here, I have a television show. I host a television show that airs on some 200 broadcast stations around the country. So I won't pretend that I am a disinterested party here. But the plea to the FCC is competition is so much greater, and the number of outlets where people can get news, entertainment, and everything else have increased so dramatically that the restrictions on consolidation in the broadcast space are outmoded. You can't own 2 broadcast entities in the same community. You can't control more than 39% of U.S. stations. All of this stuff was put in place when broadcast television and radio were it. That was all there was. And now it's a small, relatively speaking, share of people's overall consumption. And these broadcasters say, it's time to let us, I guess it reminds me of the efforts by print outlets, digital outlets, to get exemptions from outmoded antitrust laws that forbade their collusion so that they could collectively bargain with Google News and Meta and other platforms. Is that what you see?
Yeah, I do. But I also think that these are small, sort of band-aid, small fixes that are not going to really directly respond to the bigger issue at play here, which is that more and more people, especially younger Americans, are streaming the news or streaming entertainment, and they're not relying on the cable bundle. They're not relying on the big 3 broadcast networks or any of the the broadcast networks. That's increasingly sort of in the past. The one big moment I'm watching is I believe the NFL, some of the contracts are going to be up. There's going to be an opt-out in a few years, and it's very likely that the NFL, which is the big kahuna on broadcast TV, could end up moving some of their money into Netflix, into Amazon, or into some of the streaming platforms, and that's going to be another seminal moment in that is going to really be a problem for the broadcast networks. Look, the one thing I still am sort of old school in my media watching habits. I do watch the local. I do try to.
I was just going to say
local news. That is the one thing I worry about, because we saw in the print, like what is the consequence for politics and democracy when you don't have a local newspaper in your hometown? We've seen sort of the downstream effects of that over the last decade. Local TV news is one of the last bastions where you can actually get information about your larger community. And if we continue to see this migration away from those traditional networks, what is local? There's not going to be any local anything, and that's not good. That is one of the most trusted forms at least in a low trust age, a low trust environment, people still look at their local newscasts and say, I can trust what I'm seeing on that television.
And they trust it because it is typically not very political at all. As a person who, again, I'm producing political content that airs on a cable news channel, but also airs on broadcast stations. And it's tricky because the brand for local news is mostly to avoid politics and mostly to, they'll cover the county commission and they'll cover a big court case. And when it's election time, they'll certainly do some coverage, but it's mostly about crime, schools, weather, traffic. It's about the quotidian concerns of everyday life that people are experiencing. And that's part of why it enjoys higher trust. In the research for my most recent book, that came through again and again and again. The reason that local TV news retained not just high trust, but high profitability was that it did not have a business model based on what the national news media is based on, which is politics, which leads to partisan politics, which leads to siloing, which leads to trust destruction. Haram. Okay, Eliana's gone, so we can talk sports. And for folks who were hoping this week that they would get content about the Real Housewives or handbags, Josh and I are not going that direction. We're going to talk about sports this week. And here's one that's made for you. It's sports and politics. Stephen A. Smith no longer ruling out the possibility of running for president in 2028. This is from Barrett Media. Over the last few weeks, I've had no choice but to get more serious about it, he shared. I've been approached by people on Capitol Hill. I've been approached by people who are elected officials in office, whether it's governors or mayors or what have you. People have legitimately, seriously asked me about it. I have no desire to be a politician, but I've decided that I'm no longer going to close that door. I'm going to keep my options open. What say you, Josh?
So as an aside, trends in sports media are actually pretty similar to some of the trends in regular news media, in that the kind of serious coverage, the sports centers, the E60s, the documentaries, 30 for 30 on ESPN, they're being overshadowed by a guy who has a 3-hour show in the morning that just yells and shouts and offers hot takes without a whole lot of, evident reporting or, news gathering behind it. So I think Stephen A. Smith is a perfect reflection of where our politics are and the same trends in our, in politics, like celebrity matters, being loud and obnoxious matters. And look, I think there could be an opportunity for an unconventional type of candidate. I've always thought Mark Cuban in the sports world, former Mavericks owner, is the guy who may make a little more sense.
I think he's too conscientious. I think Mark Cuban is too conscientious to succeed in a presidential candidacy. I think he's trying too hard. I think you got to be crazy, and I don't think he's crazy enough.
He's got money, but you're right. He's engaged, and he's actually gotten pushed back a little bit. Look, Stephen A. Smith, and I think one of the appeals with Stephen A. Smith is that he doesn't. So he's actually pushing away and attacking the Democratic Party, even though I think that's more his natural identification, the party he identifies with. So he is coming across as sort of an independent at a time when a lot of people don't trust the two-party system and want something different. So he's an outsider. He's loud. He's certainly obnoxious, and he may reflect the political zeitgeist that we're in right now. And of course, the way that you win party nominations in the 21st century, we know, is to attack your own party. That's in a remarkable turn of events. The way that you win your party is by attacking your party, because the people who dislike each party the most are its own members. Okay. You're a serious baseball fan. You're not some fly-by-night, Johnny-come-lately bandwagon rider. Torpedo bats. For Real Housewives fans, the torpedo bat is a dude who went to MIT, who worked for the Yankees, came up with a new way, as I understand it, to shape the wood, to shape the ash wood that is used in the manufacture of baseball bats, to give it a much thicker barrel.
and the Yankees debuted this bat to resounding success, crushing a dozen home runs or something. And of course, the sports world was agog. Great piece on this subject, which was really good for me to read because I, as the kids would say, felt seen in this column in the Washington Post. Because it's a sport that normal people care about most when they are younger, baseball is perpetually set up to disappoint. Our most powerful connection to it came when we were too young to understand how the real world works. Baseball is supposed to be pure in a way that no other sport is expected to be. This yearning for a never actually real innocence, as anyone who has lived through the last decade of American life knows, inexorably manifests itself in a sort of weaponized nostalgia. If things now aren't the way I pretended they were when I was a little kid, something must be wrong. And I read it, and I was abashed immediately because I didn't know why I didn't like the torpedo bats. And then I read this and I thought, oh, because I, who in political life rail constantly against nostalgia, I have called it a yearning for a time that never was, and how dangerous and deadly nostalgia is in other places. And then I realized this cat was reading my mail. He knew what I was about. This is Will Leitch, I guess it is pronounced, Leitch, writing at the Washington Post. And Will, you got me. You nailed me. Where are you, Josh, on the torpedo bat?
Well, I'm more of a nostalgic, especially when it comes to baseball. I don't like the ghost runner on second in extra innings. I don't like all these wild cards. I think baseball is the meritocratic sport where you got to win your division. You should have to, actually achieve something in 162 games to actually get to the playoffs. So I'm not a big fan of a lot of the changes.
Where are you on the pitch clock?
I'm generally for the pitch clock, but I think getting to the torpedo bat, there is I do favor changes to actually get the game back to where it was in its glory days, and that was when players wouldn't strike out all the time. And wouldn't, right. I guess the line you hear about baseball now is that there are three true outcomes. You got a strikeout, a walk, or a homer, but a lot of people aren't putting the ball in play like they used to. And if the torpedo bat actually generates more action, more offense, puts the ball in play, it prevents some of the strikeouts that are proliferating throughout the game, I'm all for it. The Yankee, it's like Moneyball. The one team figures out a way to kind of beat the system, and then everyone else kind of chases that fad. I am for more offense. I think the sport could use a little more excitement, and if the torpedo bat is the way to go about it, I'm 100% behind that. So I do think that there's certain things I want to protect as part of my nostalgia, but there are other things that I kind of almost want to get back to that I think baseball's sort of gotten away from what made it successful in its glory years, and more offense, putting the ball in play more. If you can figure out how to tweak the rules, tweak the equipment to get to that point, count me in.
If it'll help get the Cardinals back above 500, I'm all for it. I learned my lesson with the pitch clock, which I disdained. And as George Will wrote, sometimes a traditionalist is surprised that something works. So maybe this will work. Could be a facile file, but it's a sports facile file. Fossil fuel companies target America's love of college sports. This CBS News expose says that in a shocking turn of events, fossil fuel companies are advertising where people are watching television. It's a real stunner. It's really hard to imagine that the people who are spending advertising money wish to spend it in places where people are watching. Here's the lead. Americans love college sports, and so do oil and gas companies. About 96% of more than 2,000 fossil fuel ads aired during the national games between 2022 and 2024 were during college football and basketball, compared to about 4% for professional sports, according to CBS News data analysis. Goes on, Duncan Meisel, a climate activist and leading voice against advertising by fossil fuel companies, said many of these ads during televised games talk about supporting communities and the environment without ever acknowledging industry's role in climate change. Really? Are you surprised, Duncan Meisel, that these companies do not put a big disclaimer at the end that said, climate change is real and we are killing the planet. Give me a break. Give me a break. This piece blew my mind. Of course, they're advertising where the viewers are. I don't fully understand the pro versus college split. Maybe that the ads are more affordable. Maybe that they're trying to get a more affluent demographic. I don't know why, but sports are the only thing that people are watching on TV in large numbers. So I'm not surprised that people are running ads there.
Yeah, God bless the oil and gas industry. The free market, they can choose to advertise where they want to advertise. Look, I think the reason college sports is more of an enticing market is that you actually have college markets like in the South and in the Midwest, Iowa, Birmingham, Alabama, all the big successful schools in basketball and football are actually, many of them are in red states and actually have a more conservative demographic. So I think that maybe they're trying to reach, as opposed to perhaps NBA or baseball where you have big cities, bluer areas, maybe they find that there's more of a receptive market viewership for college sports. But
how much of this could just be Texas and Louisiana alone, right? How much of this is Texas? Yeah, Texas A&M, Baylor, Texas Tech, TCU, LSU. We could, all of how many states? How about the University of Kentucky Wildcats? How about the West Virginia University Mountaineers? How about all of those states, as you say, where if you're going to run ads to say, hey, neighbor, howdy ho, neighborino, just letting you know that we're some nice folks from the American Petroleum Institute and we're okay. We're okay. We're good neighbors. That would be a great place to run those things. I found what made my head ache about this was they took a very obvious thing. You advertise where you think the viewers you want to reach are, and then made it sound like they were. I've many times decried the willingness of the sports industrial complex to swallow online gambling as if it were no different from anything else, right? I assume that we'll get to hear Jim Nantz after this is Masters Week. I assume that we'll get to hear Jim Nantz after he says, hello, friends, tell people how to go on FanDuel and bet a parlay for the Masters. And there's the relationship between sports media and sports journalism and gambling is, my rule of thumb is don't do anything that you wouldn't do for liquor, right? And I don't think Jim Nantz would say, now remember, make sure to, while you're watching the match, enjoy a cold Bacardi and Coke. That's right. Delicious liquor. They probably wouldn't do that, but they're doing gambling is in everything. So I'm not saying there's no line here, but this is a paid ad for a legal product, and relax.
And it's much better than that moment in time where we heard all kinds of woke activism in sports, like in the advertising marketplace, which was not what a lot of fans wanted to see. So we're starting to kind of get back to kind of normalcy, I think, with this.
Okay, well, here's another bit of normalcy. It's time for our obsessions of the week. These are the stories where we take a little deep dive on what we couldn't get out of our heads. And Josh, it just like baseball, the visitor gets the first at bat.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chris. I've been obsessed with all these the AI influence in major media newsrooms, and AI. I started to experiment with it, using it a little bit, but I find for journalism, you don't want to have AI do your story for you, and a lot of publications are now having AI summarize the columns or stories, and Bloomberg is one of those publications, but apparently, at least in about 36 stories in recent weeks, they've had to correct the AI summation of the stories. And AI can be a remarkable tool. It can make certain things easier for journalists, but to just go on autopilot and to just actually have someone without an editor, without anyone looking at these summations, doing it on autopilot just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. People are paying a lot of money to get information from Bloomberg, and to just have a AI bot do it for you. And then apparently there are a lot of corrections that have had to be made. It takes more time to kind of go through the content and go through make sure everything's accurate than it would be just to have a regular journalist write a sentence or two about what their story is about. So I get AI, it seems to be the future, but it doesn't seem like it's being used very effectively in a lot of newsrooms.
But are you going to keep experimenting with it at Jewish Insider?
I will say that one thing it is good for is like just coming up with a subject line or a headline. That is one thing. I've been using AI myself lately, but let the reporters do the reporting. Let the columnists do the opining. I think those, hopefully AI can stay far away from that.
I think that for local news particularly, there's a huge upside with AI. And we've talked on this podcast about Patch, trying it out. I think there's a lot that can be done to bolster the struggling local news market. But for a high-end product like Bloomberg, no. You got to be careful. Okay, my obsession. Trump orders DOJ to investigate prominent critic in shocking Oval Office remarks. I think he's guilty of treason. This is from Mediaite. And this is about a news story. This is the anonymous guy. You remember this guy from the first Trump administration? He was, what's his name? Miles Taylor. So this was the guy that wrote the big op-ed in the New York Times that said that he, secret agent man, he and a cabal of right-minded, decent Americans were undermining Donald Trump at every turn. And then he was eventually outed. And then he wrote a book about this idea. And first, just on the question of Donald Trump signing executive orders or executive memoranda, ordering the Justice Department to investigate his political enemies. It's not good, Bob. It's not good, whether it's a law firm or I think the most recent batch included a directive to basically, it's a bill of attainder. I order my government to harass and attack my political enemy is very bad, is a very un-American way of doing things. But setting that to one side briefly, the phenomenon of this guy who wrote this anonymous piece and it turned into a sensation and he became sort of a hero of the left, and this reassurance to people that not only was Trump being undermined, but that the forces of decency would constrain his worst impulses. Trump's decision to target this guy, say that he's guilty of treason, direct Pam Bondi to go after him, is a very clear message from Donald Trump that he will not be constrained, right? What's Donald Trump's hatred of Mike Pompeo? Why does Donald Trump hate Mike Pompeo, who seemed to do a pretty good job from outward appearances as the CIA director and Secretary of State? What? And the answer is the people who gloated about what they were able to do to stop Trump from being Trump. Bill Barr wrote a book in which he basically said, yeah, Trump had many bad ideas, many were illegal, and I was the one who stopped him. H.R. McMaster, who I don't know whether you saw this piece, but it was hilarious, in which H.R. McMaster accidentally got a phone call from Trump. Did you see that, Josh?
I did. They gave me a laugh.
Trump asked to get Henry McMaster, the governor of South Carolina, on the phone, one of his staunchest political allies. And instead, the White House switchboard punched up H.R. McMaster, who Donald Trump hates like God hates sin, and H.R. McMaster, who is now a CBS News contributor, I think.
Yeah.
Who knows what the source was for that CBS News had, but H.R. McMaster got the phone call. Why does Trump hate these people? Why is he going after these people? Well, he hates them, one. But two, he's sending a message to the press. He's sending a message to people inside the government. Today, right before we started recording this, they withdrew the nomination of a woman to lead the Bureau of Land Management at the Department of the Interior because she had said privately after January 6th that what Trump was doing was reprehensible. She's out. So this Miles Taylor, I guess, let me put it this way. The peacocking and swanning of Miles Taylor and others who wanted credit for being such virtuous people, ultimately, if what we're living through right now is any indication, was not useful or effective. And the crackdown that Trump is engaged in and that his administration is engaging to try to stifle dissent is so far working, right? And people ought to do whatever they think they ought to do. The conscientious choice that you feel like you have to make in your work. And, we've seen prosecutors quit and people leave their jobs rather than comply with what the administration's doing. But this is an interesting coda to one of the archetypes of the first Trump term, which is the celebration of the internal resistance and people inside the government sticking it to Trump. Well, Trump's sticking it to them in a big way now. All right. I've now obsessed. Oh, well, which brings us to, I don't usually get to do this part, Josh. That brings us to Eliana's favorite time of the show, which is reader mail. Hello, Chris and Eliana. I am a regular listener, usually on my Friday run across the George Washington Bridge here in New York City. My condolences. Listening to me while running seems inapt, but I only run when chased. I appreciate your reporting and outlook immensely. Oh, thank you. On today's podcast, the subject of the French fry came up, and Chris, I was so ready for you to absolutely nail that JoJo potatoes are the regional specialty of the Pacific Northwest. What? I'm originally from Seattle, and JoJo potatoes, as far as I know, are standard in at least all of Washington state. Wikipedia is not helpful on this one as it redirects to the potato wedge, but these two links, one from Portland in 2017 and this one from Seattle in 2021, confirm my suspicions. Appalachia is beautiful and no doubt has some killer cuisine, but our region, sir, is home to Idaho and its flagship crop. Thanks always, Lauren Hendricks. Ms. Hendricks, I don't know what to say. I strongly associate the JoJo potato with Moe's Convenience Store on Route 88 in Ohio County, West Virginia. R.I.P. Moe's Convenience Store, a place where my brother and I were both, I think we were both forbidden to rent video VCR tapes because of laggardly return times on the tapes, and they put your name up on the behind the register. But they definitely had delicious JoJo potatoes. And everybody around in the Ohio Valley, let's hear, I guess I'd like to hear, I hear, Ms. Hendricks, what your biased media from the Pacific Northwest says. If there are any listeners out there that are from the Ohio Valley and can speak to the question of the rightful proprietor of the JoJo potato, please email us and let us know. But thanks for listening, and I hope your run is a pleasant one this week, Ms. Hendricks. Okay, that brings us to my favorite time of the week. And that's when we both have to say something nice, and I will lead by example. This was really wrenching and really good. CBS News had footage, pictures inside the prison camp in El Salvador where the U.S. government is sending those deemed undesirable. And it was so, I guess for me, I was reminded of something that, well, I'll read you the lead. 3 weeks ago, photojournalist Philip Halsinger stood on a tarmac in El Salvador waiting for 3 planes to arrive, cameras slung across his body. He was told the planes were carrying Venezuelan migrants from the United States and would become inmates. Oh, my iPad just shut off. But suffice it to say, this is a wrenching firsthand account about what these folks are going through. And if you are one who says, well, sometimes you got to break a few eggs to make a golden age omelet, and who cares? The story of just put yourself in the position of if you were an innocent person, if you had come to the United States, had obtained asylum or were seeking asylum, and were mistakenly, as the administration now acknowledges, were mistakenly shipped off to this horrifying prison camp in El Salvador, where you would be and where your family would be and what it would be like. So this was so good on CBS for getting somebody down there, covering it in this way, and for doing it like this. It was, I'm sure, expensive, probably dangerous, and worth doing because the images are arresting indeed. Josh, what do you got?
So my favorite item is, well, I like David Brooks. I like reading his column in the New York Times, and
He's a good writer.
he's a good writer, good thinker. There's always an idea that's somewhere that makes you think. But when he writes these epic kind of 10,000 word pieces in the Atlantic, you always know that there's something good there. And he wrote a piece that made me think in the Atlantic about sort of the debate and divide between conservatives versus reactionaries. And he basically makes the point that even though there seem to be real divides in the Republican Party and the conservative movement, that he should have seen it coming because there actually were pretty deep differences, even going back to the Reagan era, where he was getting his start at the Washington Times, Wall Street Journal editorial page, National Review. And he had a line in there that I just thought was really, really important. He said, like, there's a difference between conservatives and reactionaries. He said he read Milton Friedman, James Burnham, Whittaker Chambers, and the reactionaries were pretty much, even back then, wanted to own the libs. And even though the conservatives cared about certain principles, free markets, fighting against tyranny abroad, traditional values, that it was really just about being against the left among another part of the movement. So he talks about his own personal kind of political experiences, but he really draws the conclusion that there's not a whole lot different, even though everyone generally agreed on the same principles back in the in the glory days. That really what you're seeing among the divisions in the party and in the conservative movement and between MAGA and more conventional conservatives is an adherence to principles versus being against and actually disliking something even more than the principles you hold. So I thought it was a really smart piece. It wasn't just about politics, but it was about his own personal life experiences. And it is, very much worth, it's a long piece, but very much worth the read.
It's almost as if nostalgia is a yearning for a time that never was. Josh, I will be rightfully nostalgic about this podcast after it is finished, because this was a real pleasure and you're a real pro. I would encourage everybody to subscribe and read to Jewish Insider, Goyim included. It's good to read. It's good journalism, and keep up the good work, Josh. And thanks for being with us.
My pleasure being here. Thanks.
Okay.
Chris.
And that's the news about the news. You got it. If you have a story you want us to talk about, email us at wretches@nebulouspodcast.com and sign up for our newsletter at nebulouspodcast.com. This has been Ink-Stained Wretches from Nebulous Media, produced by the always punctual Colin Chicola. Find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Wretches.